The world had always been a place of unseen wonders, hidden beneath the surface of what people believed was reality. But for Thomas Mitchell, life had become a suffocating routine, a monotony that gnawed at his soul. Little did he know, everything was about to change, and not in the way he would have ever imagined. It all started one evening, just like any other. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment in the city, trying to fall asleep. But tonight, sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind raced, thoughts spinning in a chaotic frenzy. It wasn't until the clock struck 3 a.m. that something strange happened. He blinked, and suddenly, he wasn't in his room anymore. He was standing in the middle of a crowded street, surrounded by people he didn't know. The scent of street food filled the air, and the sounds of chatter echoed around him. His heart pounded in his chest. What is this? Where am I? His voice felt foreign in this new reality. Thomas had no idea that he had just crossed into a new world, one where dreams and reality had blurred into something altogether incomprehensible. The sensation of the place, its vividness, struck him like a bolt of lightning. It was as if he had been thrust into the dream of someone else. But there was something more, he could feel it. Thomas wasn't dreaming, he was inside someone else's dream. Thomas Mitchell wasn't a man of great ambition. In fact, his life could be summed up in one word, ordinary. A middle-aged man in his early 40s, he lived in a small, cluttered apartment on the edge of town. His career as a data analyst wasn't exciting, and his social life could be described as non-existent. He spent his days in front of computer screens, analyzing numbers that seemed to blur together after hours of work. At night, his routine was just as predictable: dinner, a quick browse through TV shows, and then off to bed to repeat it all again. But what made Thomas different was his deep yearning for meaning in a world that felt disconnected. He often wondered if there was something more to life than what he was experiencing. Perhaps it was this yearning that made him open to the idea of the bizarre experiences that were about to unfold. When it happened, Thomas was skeptical at first. He chalked it up to a vivid dream, but deep inside, he knew that what he had just witnessed couldn't have been a mere figment of his imagination. He had always been a man of logic, someone who relied on facts and reason. Yet here, in the waking dreamscape, all his beliefs were being shattered. But who could he turn to? How could he explain that he had somehow stepped into someone else's mind and witnessed their thoughts as if they were his own? As the night wore on and the street dissolved, he found himself standing in his bedroom once again, heart racing, breath shallow. What was that? He muttered to himself. The next few nights, Thomas began to experience it again. He'd close his eyes to sleep, only to find himself transported to someone else's dream. In one, he was walking through an old, foggy mansion, the air thick with mystery. In another, he was flying over a vast ocean, the wind in his hair, the sensation of freedom almost overwhelming. But as he drifted from one dream to the next, a dark thought began to gnaw at him. If he could enter others' dreams, why couldn't he leave his own? The truth came to him gradually, a slow realization that began to take shape like a shadow creeping into his mind. Every time he tried to wake up, he found himself trapped in the same dreamscape. It was as if he couldn't escape. The more he traveled into the minds of others, the more distant his own reality became. He would wake in his own bed, only to feel the heavy weight of something different. A sense of unease settled over him, gnawing at his thoughts. It was as if he was still in the dream, but no longer in control. No longer in his own mind. "Why can't I leave?" he cried one night, his voice trembling in the silence of his apartment. His desperation echoed in the empty space, as though even the walls were closing in on him. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a curse. Thomas had discovered a power, a gift, but at what cost? He could enter anyone's dream, but he could never escape his own. The first time Thomas became aware of the consequences of his newfound ability, he had just finished visiting a dream of a friend, a childhood acquaintance whom he hadn't seen in years. He had been immersed in the person's dream, following them through a series of vivid scenes filled with emotional highs and lows. It was a beautiful, fleeting experience. But as he tried to return to his own bed, he found himself stuck, suspended in an endless void. He could hear voices, see flashes of memories that weren't his own. It felt as though his body was anchored in place while his mind was free-floating, unable to land. He screamed out into the void, "Help! Somebody, please!" But there was no answer. The horror of being trapped inside his own mind, unable to escape, dawned on him fully. His yearning for connection with others had led him to this point. Now, he was paying the price for meddling with forces beyond his understanding. And so, the journey of discovery became one of survival. Every dream he entered was another chance to understand what was happening to him, but each experience only left him further from the truth. Could he ever wake up? Could he ever escape? Only time would tell. As Thomas grappled with the reality of his predicament, he began to question the very fabric of his existence. Was this really a curse, or had he stumbled upon a path that could offer him the ultimate freedom, if only he could find a way to control it? The world of dreams beckoned, but it was no longer a place of wonder, it was a prison. And Thomas Mitchell was its unwilling inmate. This was just the beginning of a journey into the depths of his own consciousness, where each step took him deeper into a place he couldn't escape. Where every answer only raised more questions. Would he ever find peace? Or would he be doomed to live forever between dreams and reality? One thing was certain, he would never be the same again. For weeks, Thomas had been struggling with the inexplicable force that had dragged him into the world of dreams. Each night, as he fell asleep, he braced himself for the inevitable journey into the mind of another person, the brief moments of escape from his own mind's prison. But each time he woke up, he felt more distant, more trapped in the cycle he couldn't break. It wasn't just the dreams anymore, it was the sense of losing himself. Then, one night, everything changed. It began like any other night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm the racing thoughts that seemed to flood his mind. Every night felt the same. A few minutes of uncertainty, the sensation of drifting away, and then, nothing. Or so he thought. But tonight, as he slipped into sleep, something was different. There was no city street, no mansion, no ocean breeze. This time, he found himself in a dark, endless void, one that felt suffocating, as though the very air had turned against him. He had become used to the strange, surreal landscapes of other people's dreams, but this was different. There was no warmth or vibrancy here, no flickering images of a distant world. There was only darkness, cold and unyielding. "Hello?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling in the emptiness. His breath was shallow, panic rising in his chest. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Thomas stood motionless, the weight of the dark space pressing down on him. His heart thudded in his chest as the endless blackness surrounded him like a thick fog, stifling every thought that tried to surface. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were frozen in place. He struggled, clenching his fists, his mind racing. Something was wrong. He couldn't wake up. Not this time. And then, something changed. He saw it. A flicker in the distance. A light, barely visible at first, then growing brighter as it moved toward him. Thomas squinted, the anticipation gnawing at him. The light grew larger and larger until he realized it wasn't just a light, it was a figure. Someone was walking toward him through the darkness. "Who's there?" Thomas whispered, the fear now creeping into his voice. The figure, a woman, appeared slowly, her features shrouded in shadow. As she stepped closer, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as though he should know her, but the memory was just out of reach. "Please." The woman's voice echoed in the void, soft and distant. "You have to listen to me." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "What's going on? Where am I?" The woman stopped in front of him, her form now fully visible. She was dressed in white, her hair long and flowing, her eyes full of sorrow. "You're not alone, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "You never have been." Before Thomas could respond, the figure vanished into thin air, as if swallowed by the darkness. His heart raced in his chest, the void pressing in on him once again. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What was that?" he shouted into the silence. "Who are you?" But there was no answer. Only the oppressive silence. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself spiraling deeper into confusion. The memory of the woman lingered in his thoughts, haunting him. He could feel her presence like a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. But why? Who was she, and why had she appeared in his dream? He had no answers, only questions that piled on top of one another like an unending mountain. Desperation set in. He needed to understand what was happening to him, what this power meant, and whether there was a way to control it. He couldn't keep drifting through other people's lives, only to return to his own unchanging prison. The frustration boiled inside him, pushing him toward action. One night, as he lay in bed, the familiar sensation of drifting into sleep washed over him. But this time, he refused to go quietly. Instead of waiting for the dream to take him, he focused all his energy on breaking free. He clenched his fists, willing himself to wake up. "Come on," he whispered urgently. "Wake up." For the first time, something responded. The world around him began to distort, the air thickening, the walls of the dream bending and stretching as if they were alive. His heart pounded in his chest as the pressure built up, and for a moment, he thought he would suffocate in the dark. But then, a blinding light pierced the darkness, and Thomas felt himself yanked into another dream. This time, it was not a peaceful place. It was chaotic, shattered glass and fire everywhere, the world burning in front of him. A man stood in the middle of the flames, his face twisted in pain, reaching out for something just beyond his grasp. "Help me," the man screamed, his voice desperate, as if he were pleading for his life. Thomas took a step forward, but before he could move any closer, the man collapsed into the flames. The dream dissolved into nothingness, leaving Thomas standing in the middle of an empty void once again. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It was heavier. More suffocating. "Why can't I wake up?" Thomas whispered to himself, the question hanging in the air like a weight. He thought he had been moving toward understanding, but instead, he had only fallen deeper into the abyss. The boundaries between dreams and reality were becoming impossible to separate. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas's sense of time began to slip away. Every night was a journey into someone else's mind, every waking moment an exercise in survival. His thoughts became scattered, and the need to escape, to find the answers, consumed him. Then, one night, as he was drifting into sleep, he felt it again, a presence. The woman. The same figure from before. But this time, she wasn't in a dream. She was standing next to his bed, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight. "You need to listen to me," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "The key to your freedom lies within the dreams. You can leave, but only if you know how." Thomas's heart raced as he sat up, his body trembling with the weight of her words. "What do you mean? How do I leave?" The woman's eyes filled with sadness. "The dreams are not just a prison, Thomas. They are the key to everything. You must find the truth that binds them together. Only then will you be free." Before he could ask more, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the room. Thomas sat still, his breath shallow, his mind whirling. What did it all mean? What truth was she talking about? The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had been searching for freedom in the wrong place. He hadn't been trapped in a dream. He had been trapped within a much deeper, darker truth. To escape, he had to understand what bound the dreams together, what connected him to this world. Only then could he find his way back to reality. But with that understanding came a new question. Was he ready to face what lay beyond the veil of sleep? And if he did, what would it cost him? Thomas knew one thing for certain, his journey had only just begun. The days had begun to blur together for Thomas. Each night, he would fall into a restless sleep, only to wake in a new, foreign dreamscape. Sometimes, he found himself in a quiet field, other times in the middle of a raging storm. But none of the dreams ever gave him the answers he sought. The woman's cryptic words echoed in his mind, "The key to your freedom lies within the dreams." He had no idea what it meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was true. Somewhere, buried deep within this endless cycle, lay the answer to his prison. But the more he searched for it, the more he realized something crucial. This wasn't just about escaping his own mind. This was a fight for survival. One night, as he was slipping into sleep, he felt an unsettling shift in the air. It wasn't the usual sense of drifting, it was as if something was pulling him, tugging him toward a specific place. His eyes fluttered open in a foreign world, his surroundings stark and oppressive. He was standing in a crumbling city, the air thick with the stench of decay. Dark, twisting streets led him deeper into a maze of ruined buildings. There was no light, only the eerie glow of broken street lamps casting long shadows over the desolate scene. The silence felt suffocating, almost unnatural. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he took a step forward. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, quick, deliberate, and echoing through the empty streets. He spun around, but there was no one there. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. Then, as if in response to his fear, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man, his face obscured by a hood, stood in front of him, blocking his path. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and there was something predatory about the way he moved. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice unsteady, his heart pounding in his chest. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements fluid and precise, as though he were a shadow made flesh. Thomas instinctively backed away, but the man advanced, closing the gap between them. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked, his voice rising in panic. The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't know, do you? You think you're in control here, but you're not. This place, this dream, it's not yours to command." A chill ran through Thomas, a creeping sense of dread that told him this wasn't just a dream. It was something more, something that wanted to trap him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shift, the streets warping and twisting. The buildings groaned, their foundations cracking as though the entire city was coming apart. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew it was bad. The man's grin widened, his eyes flashing with malicious intent. "You're not the first to try and escape. And you won't be the last." Before Thomas could react, the man lunged at him, a blur of motion. He barely had time to raise his arms in defense before the man's hands grabbed him, dragging him into the chaos. The ground beneath them crumbled, and the city seemed to collapse into itself, spiraling into an abyss. Thomas felt his body falling, weightless and helpless. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the void, drowned in the endless blackness that surrounded him. When the world finally stopped spinning, Thomas found himself lying on the ground, gasping for air. He was back in his own bedroom, yet everything felt wrong. The walls of his apartment had twisted, bent, and stretched as though they were made of rubber. The air was thick, and every movement felt distorted, like he was trapped in a funhouse of his own creation. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Thomas froze. Who could it be? No one ever came to his apartment. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, weeks even. He rose cautiously, his legs shaky beneath him, and approached the door. His heart was pounding, a dull roar in his ears. He knew this was another dream. But it felt so real, too real. He opened the door, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman. Her pale face was illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else, something that made Thomas's stomach twist. "Come with me," she said softly, stepping forward. "It's time you understood." Thomas stared at her, confusion flooding his mind. He didn't know whether to trust her, but something in her presence made him feel like he had no choice. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. The woman's expression softened. You are not alone in this. You never have been. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Was she talking about the man from the ruined city? Was he somehow connected to all of this? Please, she whispered urgently. You have to trust me. You don't have much time. Without another word, she turned and began walking away, her figure fading into the darkness. Thomas hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at him. But something in her words stirred something deep within him, a need to understand, to escape. He had to follow her. He stepped into the darkness, the walls of his apartment warping as he walked. The floor beneath his feet seemed to dissolve into nothingness, and soon, he was no longer in his bedroom. The familiar surroundings of his apartment had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of dark, swirling mist. This way, the woman called from ahead, her voice distant but clear. Thomas hurried after her, but as he did, something strange began to happen. He felt a presence behind him, something moving in the shadows, lurking just beyond his sight. He turned, but saw nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, the ground beneath him trembled. A figure appeared, this one tall and imposing, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the mist. It was the man from the ruined city, standing in front of him like a sentinel. You're too late, the man sneered, his voice cold and cutting. You think you can escape this place? It's already over. The woman, now standing beside Thomas, glanced at him with urgency. Run, she commanded. But before they could move, the man lunged at them, his hand reaching out like a claw. Thomas barely had time to react as the woman shoved him aside, taking the brunt of the blow. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath. No! Thomas shouted, his heart sinking as he rushed to her side. The man laughed, the sound echoing in the mist. You'll never escape. Not now. Not ever. The woman's hand reached out to him, her eyes filled with fear. You must find the truth. Her voice faltered, and her hand dropped limply to the ground. Thomas's world spun out of control as the man's presence loomed over them. Desperation surged within him. He couldn't lose her, he couldn't lose his chance to understand this nightmare. But in the face of the looming threat, he was left with no choice. He had to act, and fast. With one last look at the woman, Thomas stood and sprinted into the swirling mist, the sound of the man's laughter ringing in his ears. He had no idea what the truth was, but he would find it, he had to. The mist was thick around Thomas as he ran through the swirling void, the sound of his frantic breathing and pounding heart the only things he could hear. The dark figure, his enemy, was not far behind, the ground shaking beneath each step the man took. The words the woman had whispered to him echoed in his mind, you must find the truth, but what truth? What did she mean? He couldn't lose focus. He couldn't allow himself to give in to the panic. He had no idea where he was running or what he was running from anymore, but the man's laughter behind him cut through the thick fog like a razor-sharp blade, relentless and mocking. He had to make it out. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. Behind him, the man's voice rang out, low and dangerous. You can't escape, Thomas. You're mine now. Thomas's feet slipped on the wet ground, his legs giving out for a moment as he crashed into the soft earth. The mist was so thick it was suffocating, wrapping around him like a living thing. He scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he wiped the fog from his eyes, but it was no use. He couldn't see anything through the dense haze. The world felt like it was closing in on him. Focus, he thought, forcing himself to breathe deeply. I'm not giving up now. But the more he ran, the more he felt the weight of the man's presence following him, pressing down on his shoulders, like a shadow that would never leave him. Thomas had no choice but to push through. He had to find the truth. He had to find it before it was too late. His eyes darted around, his pulse racing as the woman's words resurfaced in his mind. The truth binds them together. What truth? What could that even mean? Everything about this place felt like a trap, a labyrinth of shifting, ever-changing dreams, each one darker than the last. Suddenly, there was a break in the fog ahead. A flicker of light, small and weak at first, but growing brighter the closer he got. He squinted, unsure whether it was real or another illusion, but something inside him urged him forward. As he approached, he saw the woman again. She was standing there, her figure illuminated by the pale light. Her eyes were wide with something he couldn't place: fear, urgency, desperation. "Thomas," she called out, her voice trembling. "You have to listen to me." He stopped just in front of her, barely able to keep his legs from collapsing beneath him. "I don't understand," he gasped. "What do you mean? What's the truth? What binds everything together?" The woman's face was full of anguish as she reached out to him. "The truth, it's you, Thomas," she said softly. "You're the one who has the power to break this. You've always had it, but you've been running from it." Thomas's mind reeled. What was she talking about? He had never asked for this power. He didn't want it. All he wanted was to escape, to return to his own life. "You're the key," she continued, her voice shaking. "But you have to face it. You have to face the one thing that's been holding you here." "Face what?" Thomas demanded, his voice raw with frustration. "What's keeping me here?" The woman's expression faltered. "The darkness inside you," she whispered. "You can't run from it anymore. You have to confront it. Only then will you be free." Before he could respond, there was a loud crash from behind him, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crushing the earth beneath them. Thomas turned, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the figure, emerging from the mist. The man's eyes were filled with a cold, predatory hunger. "You think you can just run away from me?" he snarled, his voice dripping with malice. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the man took a step forward. There was no more room to run. He had nowhere left to go. The woman was right. The only way out was to confront the man, to face whatever it was that had bound him to this dream world in the first place. "You're not real," Thomas shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "None of this is real." The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the fog. "What makes you think you're in control of this dream?" he sneered. "You're just a puppet, Thomas. A puppet to the darkness that controls everything. You can't escape it, because it's part of you." The woman's voice came from behind him. "He's right. You have to face it, Thomas. The darkness isn't something out there. It's inside you." His blood ran cold at her words, a deep dread settling in his gut. Could it be true? Was he the one holding himself captive? No. "I'm not like him," Thomas thought, his hands curling into fists. "I'm not like the man who's chasing me." But as the figure drew closer, something inside him snapped. The fear he had been holding back for so long surged to the surface, and with it came an overwhelming urge to fight back. He wasn't going to be a prisoner anymore. He wasn't going to let the darkness control him. He turned to face the man, his voice firm and filled with determination. "You're wrong. I'm not you. I'm not a puppet. I'm the one in control here." The man's eyes flared with rage. "You think you're in control? You think you can break free from what's inside you? You can't. You never will." Thomas clenched his jaw, refusing to back down. He had to confront this, whatever it was that had been haunting him all along. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions anymore. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, his voice carrying through the thick fog. "I will not be your prisoner." The darkness swirled around him, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire world was collapsing. But in that moment of crushing weight, Thomas felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt before. He had always been running, always been trying to escape, but now he was standing his ground. He had to face whatever darkness he had buried deep inside. He couldn't keep running from it. He had to face it head on. The man, his shadow, lunged at him with a snarl, but Thomas didn't move. He stood his ground, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of the moment. As the man reached out to grab him, Thomas raised his hands, a force he couldn't explain surging through him. "Enough!" Thomas shouted, the power of his own will flooding through him like a tidal wave. And in that moment, everything changed. The man recoiled, his form flickering like a ghost caught in a storm. Thomas's eyes widened as the fog began to dissipate, the once oppressive darkness lifting from his mind like a veil being pulled away. The figure vanished, and with it, the suffocating weight of the nightmare. Breathing heavily, Thomas collapsed to his knees, the world around him stabilizing. The woman stood beside him, her expression filled with awe and relief. "You did it," she whispered. "You faced it." Thomas looked around, realizing that he was no longer trapped in the dark void. The mist had cleared, and the dream world that had imprisoned him was finally crumbling. He had confronted the darkness inside him, and he had won. But as the world around him faded, he knew one thing for certain: he had finally escaped. The truth was clear now. He was free. The fog had lifted, and the once suffocating darkness had dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind a sense of eerie calm. Thomas remained on his knees, staring at the empty space where the man, the embodiment of his fears, had once stood. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but the oppressive weight that had followed him for so long had vanished. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was no longer trapped. The woman beside him, her face filled with wonder and relief, crouched down. Her hand reached out to touch his shoulder gently, offering both comfort and reassurance. "You did it," she repeated softly, as if still trying to believe it herself. Thomas didn't know how to respond. His mind was still reeling, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had faced the darkness inside him, he had confronted his own fears, and emerged victorious. But what did that victory mean? Was he free? Or was he still trapped in some other layer of the dream? Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, the woman following suit. They stood together, the remnants of the mist still swirling around them in faint wisps. The world had changed in an instant. The oppressive weight of the nightmare had been lifted, but the question of what came next loomed over them both. "I don't know what to do now," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse. He stared out into the horizon, the fog now gone, revealing an endless expanse of rolling hills and distant mountains. He had no idea where he was, or if this was even real. The woman turned to him, her expression softening. "You're not alone anymore. We'll find a way. You'll find your way." Thomas met her gaze, her words offering him something he hadn't had in a long time: hope. He hadn't been alone in the dream world, he had been trapped in a version of his own mind, constantly running from his fears. But now, standing here with her, something had changed. He wasn't running anymore. He had faced the nightmare, and in doing so, he had begun to reclaim control over his life. The woman smiled, sensing the shift in him. "The world is no longer bound by the darkness. You are free." Thomas nodded slowly, the weight in his chest easing. "I think I understand now," he whispered, though part of him still wasn't sure if he fully did. But there was one thing he knew for certain: he was done running. He had finally come to terms with the darkness inside him. No longer would he live in fear of what lay in his mind. Their surroundings had transformed completely. The once bleak, shadowy landscape was now bathed in soft, golden light, like the first rays of dawn breaking after a long, dark night. The ground beneath them was firm, steady, and the mist that had once been a barrier now felt distant, like a bad memory. "We need to leave this place," Thomas said, his tone steady now. "I don't know if this world is real or just another layer of the dream, but I'm not staying here any longer." The woman nodded, her face serious. "I agree. The dream will fade soon, and if we're to survive, we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Thomas felt a pang of gratitude toward her. Without her, he might have still been lost, trapped in a cycle of endless dreams. She had helped him face his own demons, and in doing so, she had shown him that freedom was possible. Where do we go from here? Thomas asked. The woman's eyes gleamed with a newfound clarity. To where the truth lies. To where you began this journey. Thomas frowned. I don't understand. The key is in your mind, she said gently. But it's not just about what you've learned about the darkness. It's about learning to trust yourself. You've always been your own prison, Thomas. But now, you can break free for good. The woman turned and began to walk away, her steps slow but purposeful. Thomas watched her for a moment before he followed. They moved together in silence, but the air around them was different now. The heaviness that had surrounded him had lightened, replaced by a sense of possibility. The dream world, once an inescapable nightmare, was fading, leaving behind the promise of something new. As they walked, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had just gone through. The fear, the confusion, the pain, everything that had brought him here now felt like distant memories. The darkness that had been his constant companion was no longer a part of him. It had been exorcised, faced, and conquered. I didn't think I could do it, he admitted after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think I could face it. But now I feel like I'm awake. You are, she replied. For the first time, you're truly awake. They reached the edge of the dream world, where the landscape seemed to blur and dissolve into nothingness. Thomas felt a pull, a soft tug in his chest, as if the dream was calling him back. But this time, he didn't listen. He had no intention of returning to that place of endless fear. He had moved past it. Thank you, Thomas said, looking at the woman who had helped him. I couldn't have done this without you. She smiled, her eyes kind. We both have our battles to fight, but sometimes, we can't face them alone. You'll be all right now. The last remnants of the mist vanished, and before them stood an open field, a place filled with promise, full of possibility. Thomas took a deep breath, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly free. The journey he had gone through had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend, but one thing was clear, he was no longer the same person he had been when he first entered the dream world. Turning to face the woman, he found himself smiling, a sense of peace settling over him. We're not done yet, he said. There's more ahead. And though the path was uncertain, he knew he would walk it with confidence, no longer a prisoner of his fears. The woman nodded, her face serene. Yes. But now, you are ready for it. Together, they walked into the horizon, leaving behind the darkness, ready to face whatever awaited them in the waking world. Thomas and the woman, whose name he had learned was Sarah, had walked for hours through the sprawling fields, their steps steady but not hurried. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden light over the land. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start after the darkness they had left behind. But as they approached the distant hills, a sense of finality hung in the air. The dream world, which had once felt so tangible, now seemed like a fading memory, and Thomas was beginning to realize that this moment, this place, was where it all ended. They stopped at the foot of a hill, overlooking a peaceful valley that stretched before them like an untouched canvas. The landscape was serene, the air crisp, and the stillness of the moment offered a strange sense of peace. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he had felt such calm. His heart, which had once been heavy with doubt and fear, now beat steadily, unburdened. We've made it, Sarah said, her voice soft but filled with a sense of accomplishment. She turned to Thomas, her eyes bright with relief. You've made it. Thomas nodded, his chest rising with a deep breath as he took in the view. I never thought I could get here. I thought I was lost forever. You weren't lost, Sarah said, her tone gentle. You were just stuck. The darkness inside you kept you from seeing the truth. Thomas looked down at the ground, feeling a quiet understanding settle in. I thought I was going to stay trapped forever. But I didn't. I faced it. I faced myself. Sarah smiled warmly, her eyes filled with a knowing that made Thomas feel as though she had seen more of his journey than he ever could. That's the hardest part. But once you do, once you face your own demons, you can't be held back anymore. You've proven that. A weight lifted from Thomas's shoulders as Sarah's words sank in. He had been consumed by fear, trapped in a world of nightmares, unable to break free. But now, standing on this hill, he realized that he had finally confronted what had haunted him for so long. And in doing so, he had overcome it. He had won his freedom. Looking out over the valley, Thomas saw the horizon stretching endlessly. He could feel the pull of the future, his future. It was uncertain, filled with challenges yet to come, but it was his to shape. He was no longer a prisoner to his mind or his fears. Where do we go from here? Thomas asked, his voice calm but tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Sarah's smile deepened, and she gestured toward the distant hills. Wherever you want to go. You've freed yourself, Thomas. Now you're the one who decides. It was a moment of clarity for Thomas. He had spent so much time letting his fears dictate his life, but now he understood something essential. Freedom wasn't just about escaping the darkness. It was about choosing where to go from there. I think I'm ready, Thomas said, looking at Sarah. Ready to face whatever's next. She nodded, the corners of her mouth curling into a small, knowing smile. I think you are, too. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but full of understanding. It was a moment of mutual recognition. Both of them had come through something monumental, something that would change the course of their lives forever. The journey had been long and difficult, but now it was over. Thomas had faced his demons and conquered them, and in doing so, he had found himself. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the dream world. He was stronger, wiser, and more certain of who he was and what he could overcome. Thomas turned away from the hill, looking down at the path that led further into the valley. I have a lot to figure out, he said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. But I'm not afraid anymore. I know, she replied, her voice steady and full of assurance. You've already taken the hardest step. With that, the two of them began walking down the hill, the world around them bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The air felt fresh, crisp with the promise of a new day. And though Thomas knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, he was no longer afraid. He had learned something profound about himself. The fear that had once controlled him no longer had any power over him. The darkness was gone, and in its place was the freedom to make his own choices. As they descended the hill and walked toward the valley below, Thomas reflected on everything that had brought him here. He remembered the overwhelming dread that had once filled him when he had been trapped in the dream world, the feeling of being lost and powerless. But now, as he walked beside Sarah, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. He wasn't lost anymore. He had found himself. I think I understand now, he said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. The darkness wasn't something I could escape. It was something I had to confront. And once I did, it lost its power over me. Sarah nodded, her expression soft but knowing. Exactly. You were never truly trapped. You just had to see it for what it was. Thomas smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of completeness. He had faced his deepest fears and emerged stronger. He had learned that the key to freedom was not in escaping the darkness, but in confronting it. Only then could he truly be free. As they continued walking, the landscape stretched out before them, an open expanse full of possibilities. The future, uncertain as it was, now seemed filled with promise. The journey had been long, but Thomas knew that with each step forward, he was walking into a new chapter of his life, one where he was no longer a prisoner to his fears, but the master of his own destiny. And that, he realized, was the true meaning of freedom. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky filled with stars. It was the beginning of a new night, and for the first time, Thomas felt at peace with what lay ahead.